The soldier was resting in the mountains with his dog when suddenly, the dog started barking at something ahead. Brian turned his head and saw a thick layer of white fog enveloping the forest. At that moment, the dog, ignoring Brian's commands, suddenly dashed into the fog. Brian hurried after it, but the dog's barking abruptly stopped without warning. It felt like something terrifying was lurking within the dense fog. Brian slowly turned his head, only to see the dog's mutilated corpse. Terrified out of his wits, Brian ran frantically out of the forest and into a nearby town to report to the police. But faced with Brian's ramblings, the police suspected he was drunk and thought he was creating and spreading panic. Brian is at a loss for words. Just then, he noticed a police officer reaching for his gun.
We gotta get guns.
Fearing Brian would cause more trouble, two officers pinned him to the ground without further ado and locked him in a cell. Brian continued to babble on. The next day, the police noticed Brian had calmed down a bit and decided to take his statement, but Brian could only remember his name. Forgetting everything else, the police thought Brian was playing games and locked him up again. Sheriff Connor was about to handle another case when a loud crashing sound suddenly came from outside. They rushed out to investigate. What they saw left them stunned. The nearby mountains were completely shrouded in dense fog, which was advancing toward the town at a speed of 2 meters per second. At that moment, Kevin received a call from his daughter. He tried to comfort her, but after a few words, the fog had already enveloped them, even disrupting the cell signal. Sheriff Connor sensed something unusual about the fog and decided to return to the station. However, Pundik saw it as a rare spectacle and wanted to take some photos for his wife. Posing with a smile on his face, he was so engrossed in his selfie that he didn't realize the danger that was approaching. Suddenly, Pundik felt something bite him. He looked around at the dense fog but paid it no mind. Soon after, more and more insects began attacking Pundik. Hearing his screams, Sheriff Connor rushed over, only to find Pundik already collapsed on the ground. The people in the station had no idea what had happened. As they opened the door, a bloodied Pundik burst in and launched a frenzied attack on Kevin. Shaken, they looked at the thick fog outside, a sense of foreboding rising within them. Their immediate concern was to contact the other townspeople, but all the phones were still without signal. Their only option was to head to the town's only mall, which had ample supplies. Little did they know, the mall was also facing a great crisis. Alex was sitting in the car waiting for her mother to get off work. Suddenly, an eerie fog rolled in from behind, covering the entire car within seconds. Accompanied by some low growls, Alex found it strange that the clear weather had suddenly turned foggy. As she wondered about it, a strange man rushed over and knocked her to the ground. Alex was instantly terrified. She quickly got up and tried to move forward, but the visibility was now less than a meter, forcing her to feel her way ahead. Moments later, Alex was horrified to see the man who had knocked her down lying on the ground in a bizarre position. Alex was scared out of her wits, but fortunately, her mother found her in time. They hurriedly fled to the nearby mall. At this moment, another mother and child were about to leave. Alex quickly stopped them and warned them about the terrifying thing in the fog. However, the woman didn't believe her and accused Alex of being melodramatic. Then she called her son and walked outside. The people inside the mall also felt something was off, but no one stepped forward to stop her. Seconds later, a desperate scream suddenly echoed. Eve wanted to walk to the door to see what had happened, but suddenly, the poor woman's jaw had been torn off. In the horrified gaze of the crowd, the woman was dragged away by a mysterious presence in the fog. The people in the mall instantly descended into chaos. No one wanted to believe the tragedy they had just witnessed, but the reality was right in front of them. The mall manager, Gus, received the news and rushed to the scene. He sent a few brave employees to check behind the door, but no one knew what kind of monster was lurking in the fog. To calm everyone down, Gus assured them that all the doors were locked and the monsters outside couldn't get in. However, not long after, Eve and two others discovered a corpse inside the mall. They hurriedly reported this to Gus. Upon investigation, they found that the body was in the administrative department, and coincidentally, the mall's only radio equipment was there too. Since all cell phones and telephones had lost signal, that radio was their only means to call for help. The question now was, who would be sent to carry out this dangerous task?
Me neither.
I'm not going in there.
Well, someone has to.
What about you? You're the leader here.
If my name is drawn, we do a lottery.
You can't force people to put themselves in danger.
Well, it's dangerous if we just sit here and wait. You have a better suggestion?
The group had no choice but to draw lots to determine who would go. Eve was very lucky to draw the lot, and although she was extremely reluctant, she had to comply. At that moment, another survivor, Clint, disregarded his friend's concerns and volunteered to go with Eve. They quickly arrived at the area where the body was found. They walked through the long hallway and indeed found the radio equipment in the office. Without a word, Clint started calling for help, but the channel and codes he used were very strange. Just as Eve was about to ask, she noticed Clint had a gun in his pocket. She pretended not to see it and slowly moved towards the door. As Clint drew his gun, Eve suddenly opened the door and ran out, and they quickly wrestled in the fog-filled hallway to avoid being heard by the others outside. Clint didn't fire his gun, but Eve doesn't care. She found an opportunity to pick up the gun. It wasn't until she had closed the hallway door that Eve couldn't hold back her tears. After finally calming down, Eve nonchalantly returned to the crowd.
Where's Clint?
We lost each other in the hallway.
And the radio.
It wasn't working.
Everyone was shocked to hear what she had to say. Since the radio was no longer usable, the mall had become an isolated island surrounded by monsters. An elderly couple, having finished their visit to the bookstore, prepared to head home. But upon opening the door, they discovered a thick fog outside. Benedict felt very strange. At 73 years old, he had never seen anything like this, but Natalie found it very dreamy and joyfully pulled her husband into the fog. The visibility was so low that they could only rely on their instincts to find their way. Just then, they heard a terrified cry nearby. Before they could react, a man with a gun suddenly appeared.
Put down the gun.
Natalie was completely flabbergasted and she stumbled backwards to escape. Fortunately, there was a wooden door not far away, and without thinking, she rushed inside. It turned out to be a church. Father Romanoff saw Natalie's terrified face and hurried over to comfort her. Sheriff Connor had also arrived there earlier, but he was powerless to help Natalie with her ordeal. The fog had brought an unknown and terrifying disaster to the town, shattering all rules and order. The few survivors could only hide in this church, barely hanging on. A few days later, Natalie still couldn't overcome the grief of losing her husband. She bid farewell to Mikhail, who had been taking good care of her, and decided to venture into the fog to find her husband's body.
But you'll die.
I have no business being alive.
Mikhail, worried about Natalie, followed her out and tried to dissuade her from taking the risk, but Natalie was very stubborn. As they were pulling at each other, a moth suddenly flew out of the fog and went straight into Mikhail's ear. Terrified, Mikhail took off his shirt, revealing a butterfly tattoo on his back. As Mikhail let out a painful howl, the tattoo began to ripple with an eerie motion. Natalie stared intently and then said,
It's beautiful.
The pain grew more intense. Mikhail's back was torn open, and butterfly wings emerged from it. Connor and Romanoff quickly pulled Natalie away, but then a swarm of moths flew out of Mikhail's mouth. In the shocked gaze of the crowd, Mikhail slowly fell to the ground, lifeless. Witnessing all this, the crowd fell into panic. Connor urgently asked Natalie why she went outside, but she coldly replied,
Because I wanted to die.
Everyone was incredulous. Perhaps the only explanation was that Natalie's mind had become unstable after the successive blows. But in the face of such a terrifying disaster, now was not the time to assign blame. Meanwhile, the survivors in the mall were also facing their own difficulties. Before going to sleep, Eve would quietly place the gun beside her to guard against anyone with ill intentions. Jay, on the other hand, tossed and turned. As Sheriff Connor's son, he had been waiting for his father to rescue them, but as time passed, this hope seemed increasingly unrealistic. Jay went to the bathroom to wash his face and clear his mind, only to find that the water supply had long been cut off. Feeling utterly dejected about his situation, he suddenly saw a terrifying scene in the mirror, scaring him almost to death. Mall manager Gus and security guard Kyle arrived quickly after hearing the news. They immediately recognized that the two people were companions of the previously missing Clint. They decided to remove the bodies and let everyone identify them. With a gentle slice of the knife, the woman's body fell into a shopping cart. Just then, Kyle, with his sharp eyes, noticed something on the woman's body. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be two name tags. These were clearly American soldiers' insignia. Could they have come from the military? Immediately after that, Jay found the name tag from the man's neck. This directly confirmed their suspicions, but questions arose. Why were soldiers in the mall? And why did they choose to commit suicide at night? With many questions, Gus and the others pushed the remains of the two soldiers to the lobby. Everyone was shocked by the sight, but no one knew the real reason behind their suicides. At that moment, a man nearby appeared especially nervous and tried to sneak away, only to be spotted by Kyle. they quickly subdued Wes. Jay searched Wes's neck and indeed found a name tag, but despite everyone's questioning, Wes claimed he knew nothing. Seeing no breakthrough with Wes, they had to let it go for now. The next challenge was how to handle the two bodies, as improper handling could lead to an outbreak of disease in the mall. Gus instructed Vic and Ted to take the bodies to the freezer, but they, wanting to save effort, simply pushed the bodies outside. Vic and Ted locked the doors and quietly waited for the monsters in the fog to appear, but after 2 hours of vigilant watching, nothing happened. As Vic and Ted grew puzzled, Wes unintentionally saw everything. Furious at their actions, he charged forward to confront them. Fortunately, Gus and the others arrived in time to separate them. Upon learning that Vic and Ted had resorted to such inhumane methods, Jay and Kyle also felt like beating them up, but at this point, they couldn't risk bringing the bodies back, so they had to establish new rules to restrain those who made mistakes. Gus gathered everyone and encouraged them to speak freely. Some suggested rationing the food. Others proposed that no one should randomly take items from the mall, as these were essential for everyone's survival. This suggestion received unanimous approval. However, Kyle made a demand that anyone who endangered everyone's safety should be thrown out of the mall. Even the others found this approach very boring, so they decided to pack up and move to the other side of the mall. Jay stepped forward to try to persuade Alex, whom he liked, to stay. Seeing this, Eve became particularly tense because she suspected Jay had assaulted her daughter. As Jay approached, Eve pulled out a gun and issued a stern warning to him. To ease the tension, Gus ultimately agreed to Eve's group's request, but he also issued a harsh warning, saying that Eve and her group could no longer expect any help from them. The two divided groups were unaware that they were about to witness a terrifying moment. Vic and Ted excitedly pulled out their harpoon guns, intent on pulling the two bodies back from the mist. They opened the door, took aim, and fired. The first shot hit its mark, and as they reeled in the line, the body of the woman was successfully pulled inside. But on Ted's second shot, the line seemed to get caught on something. Anxious, Ted followed the line to check, but he never returned. The fog had grown thicker, and the fishing line was pulled taut before it suddenly snapped. Vic called out a few times from the doorway. Hearing no response, he quickly shut the door in panic, as he prepared to take a closer look. Vic, scared out of his wits, fled without considering that Alex and Lila were reading nearby. The fog seeped in through the cracks. As soon as Alex and Lila realized what was happening, they were stopped in their tracks by a black monster that suddenly appeared in the fog. They ran in the opposite direction, only to encounter another black creature. When the panicked Vic brought the others to the scene, the entire library was already filled with thick fog. Just as Jay was about to rush in to rescue them, a shadowy creature appeared and looked at them menacingly. No one dared to act rashly. The mothers of the two girls also rushed over, but they could only watch in despair at the scene before them. Just then, Lila suddenly ran to the door, with a fog beast following close behind. In Shelley's terrified gaze, the fog beast slowly approached her daughter Lila, watching helplessly as her daughter was killed right in front of her. The poor mother instantly broke down. Eve anxiously looked inside. She saw Alex emerging from the fog, with the fog beast instantly transforming before her. Alex seemed to lose all resistance, appearing utterly lost. At this point, the people outside no longer have any hope. They believed Alex would surely meet the same fate under the attack of such a monster. The mothers, overwhelmed with grief, began to weep bitterly on the spot, but no one expected Alex to survive the ordeal and emerge unharmed from the fog. She and Eve embraced each other excitedly. Shelley was frozen. Why should her own child be the only one hurt? Mall manager Gus shot an angry glare at Vic, vowing to make him pay. The angry crowd then tied Vic up, but Vic could only apologize in the face of the crowd's accusations. But Vic had overestimated people's tolerance. In their fury, the crowd ultimately voted to expel Vic from the mall. Gus prepared some essential survival supplies for him and resolutely sent Vic out, facing the numerous dangers lurking in the fog. Vic knew his chances of survival were slim. A car comes speeding through the fog, and they look like they're running from something. They helped the injured Brian to his feet and quickly made their way to the front of the hospital. Inside, everyone was shocked. They couldn't believe that someone had actually survived the fog. Brian was rushed into the emergency room for urgent treatment, but it wasn't long before Dr. Bailey emerged with a grave expression. Due to the lack of surgical instruments, they could only stop Brian's bleeding temporarily, but they couldn't remove the bullet shell from his leg. Despite this, the group breathed a sigh of relief, as surviving this disaster was already a tremendous stroke of luck. Kevin expressed his gratitude to Bailey and then took out a photograph, hoping to ask the survivors about the whereabouts of his wife and daughter. However, after asking many people, everyone said they hadn't seen them. Exhausted and heartbroken, Kevin walked into a ward, feeling immensely guilty for not being able to protect his family. Just as he couldn't hold back his tears, a voice came from the bed behind him.
You came into this world crying and you never stopped.
Kevin turned and was surprised to see his friend Mike. He immediately stood up and asked Mike what had happened. Mike lifted up the sheet to reveal a wound in his stomach pierced by a steel bar. It turned out that the fog caused people to hallucinate, making ordinary people become brutal and cold-blooded. Mike's abdominal injury was inflicted by what seemed to be a group of weak children. Mike noticed a handgun on Kevin and asked him to end his suffering. Kevin flatly refused Mike and went out to seek Bailey's help. But Bailey also said he was powerless because Mike's injury required surgery. The operating room was located in the East Wing, which was completely shrouded in fog. Rather than watching his friend lie in bed waiting to die, Kevin decided to take a risk. He used the hospital gurney to push Mike and resolutely ventured into the fog. Not long after, they successfully reached the operating room. With Bailey's guidance, Kevin began the first surgery of his life. He first injected an anesthetic near Mike's wound, then made a 5-centimeter incision with a scalpel, used a retractor to open the sides, and forcefully pulled up the steel rod.
Now pull.
He then used sterile cotton to stop the bleeding and finally stitched the wound with a stapler. A simple surgery was thus completed. The look in Mike's eyes said it all about how grateful he was to his good brother. The two of them headed back the way they came through the dense fog. However, Kevin was so tense that he accidentally slipped and fell to the ground, and Mike tumbled heavily off the hospital gurney. Just as Kevin was about to lift Mike back onto the gurney, an eerie rain of insects began to fall from the ceiling. Seeing that they were about to be consumed by the swarm of insects, Kevin, in desperation, could only raise the gun in his hand. Having lost his friend, Kevin sat dazed in the corridor. When Bailey asked him what happened, he could only tell the truth, but at that moment, he hadn't yet realized that this seemingly kind doctor would soon pose a great danger to him. Kevin seemed to hear someone crying for help. Curious, he walked over and pushed open the door, only to see Bailey tying a woman to a hospital bed. When Bailey saw Kevin arrive, he didn't appear panicked. Instead, he gestured for him to come over and help. Kevin was just about to ask what was happening when the doctor, who had seemed so kind just a moment ago, suddenly attacked him. Kevin quickly fought back but was still thrown against the wall by Bailey. Bailey then grabbed a syringe and injected it into Kevin's neck. The drug took effect quickly, and Kevin could only collapse helplessly to the ground. When he woke up again, he found himself tightly bound. Bailey walked in holding a tray and surprisingly said sorry to him. It turned out he wanted to study the effects of the fog on humans through experiments. Because Kevin had disrupted his original plan, Bailey now had to change his test subject. Kevin was filled with deep regret. If only he hadn't meddled, but Bailey gave him no chance for regret. He took out a homemade neurotoxin and injected it into Kevin. Then Bailey deliberately opened the door wide, allowing the dense fog to pour in completely. Within just a minute, Kevin had already lost his mind. He slowly turned his head and saw the hospital bed beside him starting to melt bizarrely. On the other side, a strangely shaped owl was speaking in human language. This was beyond terrifying. Kevin thought he was really going to die this time, but just then, Brian and Adrian arrived in time. Bailey tried to stop them from rescuing Kevin, but Brian stabbed him in the chest with scissors. As the fog thickened, Brian and Adrian used all their strength to finally pull Kevin inside. But as soon as they returned to the reception area, the corridor lights went out one by one. They realized the generator had malfunctioned. Even worse, with the loss of power, all the hospital doors automatically opened, allowing the dense fog to flood in uncontrollably, while the surroundings were filled with desperate, fleeing people. Kevin and his group had no choice but to head back outside, hoping to escape using the car they had arrived in. Meanwhile, Alex was in the mall gathering survival supplies when she suddenly realized the door had been locked by someone. Soon, gasoline began to seep in through the crack under the door. She barely had time to react. Poor Alex found herself trapped in a raging inferno, screaming for help, but there wasn't a soul around. Just as she was about to be overcome by the smoke, the door was suddenly opened by someone. It was Jay, who had rushed over. He covered his right hand with a wet towel and removed the scorching hot fire extinguisher. After some effort, Jay finally managed to put out the fire. They narrowly escaped disaster, but afterward, Alex didn't thank Jay. Instead, she questioned him.
How did you know I was in there? Did you do this? Did you lock me in there so you could play hero?
What?
Jay felt deeply disappointed and said, "If I hadn't risked my life to save you, you'd be nothing but a charred corpse by now." Seeing the genuine look on Jay's face, Alex gradually let go of her suspicions. At the same time, the people in the mall made a shocking discovery. Kyle had risked his life to retrieve some flyers from outside, which boldly stated, "The National Guard is coming." The survivors were instantly overjoyed, feeling that their nightmare might finally be over, but Eve looked indifferent as she read the flyers because she had secretly printed them a few nights ago. The reason she did this was simply to give the survivors a glimmer of hope to cling to in their desperate situation. On the 10th day of the fog engulfing the small town, a severe conflict erupted among the survivors because their food was running out. No one expected that the very same Gus, who had just been righteously persuading everyone, was now in his office, contentedly savoring chocolate. Unluckily for him, Shelley witnessed the entire scene. Gus approached her, trying to persuade Shelley to keep his secret, but she remained resolute. Her daughter had been devoured by a fog beast not long ago, and Shelley was already filled with grief. While Gus only cared about his own survival, Shelley was determined to expose Gus's hypocrisy to everyone. Seeing that Shelley was adamant about leaving, Gus grabbed a candlestick from behind and struck her brutally on the back of the head. Shelley collapsed instantly in a pool of blood, and Gus pretended to panic, calling for help. By the time everyone arrived at the scene, Shelley had already stopped breathing.
Who else will do this? Who else?
Alex.
It was Alex. I saw her running away from here.
It had to be said that Gus's frame-up was very clever. Alex surviving an attack by the fog beast unscathed had already aroused suspicion among the group, and now Shelley's death made them believe that Alex was an unstable threat to everyone's safety. Soon, they captured Eve and her daughter. Gus frantically incited the crowd's emotions, and it wasn't long before the scene became a frenzy of anger. Kyle, in particular, wanted to immediately execute the supposed murderer in front of him. A woman who had a good relationship with Eve tried to speak up for her but was shot dead by an enraged Kyle. This terrified the crowd even more, with the black muzzle of the gun staring them down. Those who wanted to investigate the truth could only remain silent. In the end, Gus ordered that Eve and her daughter be thrown out of the mall without any survival equipment. It was clear that he wanted them to go out and die. Just as they were feeling utterly hopeless, a familiar voice called out from behind. It was Kevin, who had overcome numerous obstacles to reach the mall. Upon discovering that the crowd intended to let his wife and daughter die, Kevin completely lost it. He delivered a fierce punch that knocked Kyle to the ground, then pinned him down and began pummeling him. But since they were outnumbered, Kevin and his group were quickly pulled apart. At this moment, Gus picked up the gun that had fallen to the ground. With a weapon in hand, he felt even more confident. Kevin pleaded desperately. He couldn't let his family fall into danger. Yet, none of his former neighbors or friends offered any help. Instead, under Gus's instigation, they demanded that Kevin and his family immediately leave the mall. Disheartened, Kevin had no choice but to walk toward the door. The fog outside was incredibly thick, and Kevin wanted to lead his family to their car. But soon after, Alex, exhausted, lagged behind, and a dense mist suddenly surged up around her feet, quickly engulfing her completely. The snake-like fog slithered into Alex's mouth, quickly rendering her powerless. The dense fog lifted Alex's body slowly, even causing her eyes to turn white. It was only then that Kevin and his family realized their daughter had not kept up. Surrounded by a thick white mist, they couldn't see Alex at all and could only call out anxiously. Alex's situation grew increasingly dire. As the fog continued to pour in, her eyes turned completely white. Just as Alex was about to be entirely consumed by the fog, a figure appeared and pulled her out. It was Jay, who had secretly followed them out of concern for Alex. This man, once suspected of harming Alex, had saved her life multiple times. Kevin and Eve soon arrived and, without a word, helped them to the car to escape. However, Jay, due to his leg injury, was unfortunately overtaken by the fog. He reached out, hoping Alex would pull him in, but he forcibly pushed Alex into the car. After a lot of struggle, Jay finally collapsed under the erosion of the fog. At this point, I was completely devastated. The only truly good person in the entire story ended up dying in such a tragic way. Kevin and his family, though, did not immediately leave. They deliberately drove the car slowly past the mall. Reflecting on the harm done to them by those inside, Kevin made a decision. He told his family to buckle up and then slammed on the gas, reversing the car. In the terrified eyes of Gus and the others, the car sped towards the mall entrance. With a loud crash, the mall's only barrier to the outside world was completely destroyed. The dense mist began to rush in rapidly, launching indiscriminate attacks on the panicked crowd. In that moment, no matter how self-righteous they had appeared or how strong their force had been, everyone was equal before the scythe of death. If humans, in the face of disaster, abandon their most precious warmth and instead amplify their own beastliness, then perhaps death is their best release. Kevin calmly did all this and then drove the car into the fog. Whether they ultimately survived or not was no longer important. From the moment they chose to destroy everyone, they lost the right to continue being human.